And here we are again, everyone. Welcome to yet another Saving Elephants live stream, yet another great group joining us tonight. I'm going to get right into the introductions. I'm going to do them really quick because we've got a lot of ground to cover. We have Mike Taylor of the aptly named The Political Mike podcast. Good to have you with us, Mike.
Good to be here, Josh. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to have everybody say their voices for those listening just over the audio to be helpful to distinguish who's talking. The other podcast representative, Blake Fischer of The Homeless Conservative. He's got it there in his name. Blake, always good to have you.
Good to be here. This is what I sound like.
Fair enough. Steve Phelps. I think I probably know you the longest out of the whole gang here. It's nice to have you back on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here. And I don't have a podcast, so I'm a podcast orphan right now.
You should get one.
You don't currently have a podcast,
correct.
But you have. Correct. But it would not surprise me if in the days ahead you will end up on one soon. Your compadre Kent Straith, of course, is supposed to join us shortly. He's not here at the moment, but we do have John Giokaris. Good to have you, John.
Thank you for having me. And I don't have a podcast either, but that might change by the end of this as well. We'll see.
You really need, and I'm sure you'll break it out at some point in the conversation, you need to do a podcast because you could be a professional Trump voice impersonator as far as I'm concerned.
Well, geez, you're very kind. You're very sweet. I appreciate it. We're back in the golden age, everybody. Let's go. Let's hit it up.
Exactly.
I need more hand motions, though. More hand motions.
The topic tonight, is Trump a fascist, is admittedly quite a bit more clickbaity of both the topic and the picture I used for this than I ordinarily have. Those of us joining hoping for a complete brawl, I mean, we might get one, who knows, but that's not necessarily my intention. I don't honestly know what everybody's opinions are of this, other than I think Steve had mentioned he wanted to downgrade the term fascist. Let's knock that down a level or two. But I will gladly get into it. But I wanted to share with you guys up front kind of how I'm envisioning or hoping this conversation would go, sort of a two-parter. The first part is not so much is Donald Trump a fascist, but what is a fascist? What do we even mean by some of these terms? And then once we have, I won't say agreed on, but at least put our priors out, here's what I'm talking about when I say that, then we can get into the whole topic of, okay, to what degree does Donald Trump meet our understanding of that? Does he or does he not? And so I will kick things off because I didn't say Nazi, is Donald Trump a Nazi? Because I think that, first of all, it's historical context. It would be very odd for Donald Trump to be, touting the benefits of the Aryan race in Central Europe. Plus, Nazi is obviously a far more emotionally loaded term, even though fascist itself can be. I do want to caution everyone about, I'm sure you're all very familiar with Godwin's law. If you haven't heard, I'll quote it here. As an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1. This is, of course, witnessed over and over in conversations. So I want to try to do some level setting. I personally would say that a fascist is an authoritarian and a nationalist and other things as well. And I'm going to define those terms very quickly for us here. And I'll kind of, since this can take a moment, I think what I would like to do is say, since I'm using this version, he's an authoritarian and a nationalist. That would be a fascist. I'm going to very quickly define what I mean by those two things. And then I will give everyone an opportunity to tell me if that is to their liking or if they want to modify that definition somewhat. A nationalist is an individual who has a great deal of patriotism for their nation state. And while I don't agree with Doherty in a lot of things of National Review, he has a working definition of nationalism that I think is incredibly helpful. He says that nationalism is patriotism in its agitated state. And he uses examples often like, Pearl Harbor, World War II. There's a lot of, air quotes, nationalism in the United States when we're in danger of warfare, when we're threatened in some capacity. And based on that definition, he would say, and I would agree, that nationalism is neither good nor bad. It is just an emotional state. The real question is, well, what are you directing that ire toward? What has got you so worked up? What has got you in such a fit? If we're in danger of being invaded, that's probably a very appropriate time to express some sort of nationalist creed or idea. An authoritarian, of course, is neither left nor right. They're ones who, generally speaking, eschew democratic norms, institutions. They tend to lock up opposition. They tend to, and I say tend to, they can range from just an absolute dictatorship to those sort of leaning in that direction. but that the desire is that the central control controls everything, right? The authoritarian gives you the orders, and the followers simply obey. It's has some positive benefits in the sense that it has order, cohesiveness. Everybody knows their place, but obviously can go very awry. I realize already we're probably getting way too out in the weeds, so let me just turn it over to you gentlemen. First of all, do you agree with that? A fascist is both an authoritarian and nationalist. And second, if so, how would you color that definition?
So when I was, and by the way, I hate that you have brought this whole thing up, because I've been trying to stay away from this for years because it seemed too easy, but the more you think about it. So I based a lot of research and a lot of thoughts regarding the definition of fascism on I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Roger Griffin. He wrote a lot about fascism in the 1990s, early 2000s. And I chose not only because he is an esteemed political thinker, but because he wrote about this before Donald Trump was on the scene as a political figure. So I like that it was free from any of the modern stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he talked about amongst the definitions of what a fascist is yes, authoritarianism, absolutely. Strong centralized government for control, yes. Populist or national, ultra-nationalist, yes. But then also he included how important it was, someone who instilled the mythology of a national rebirth. Someone who was selecting to create a war on a perceived weakness of a nation. Charismatic leader, yes. National homogeneity, yes. Physical extermination of outside groups. These are the ways that he defined a fascist society. And obviously a fascist to follow would be someone who believed in the kind of the tenets of that and pursued some sort of ends with those in mind. I guess I would take what you have and probably add a few extra. And I think that is important, because I think calling someone a fascist becomes too easy if they're just a nationalist and authoritarian. You really gotta really go, I think, the extra mile. And I think that definition that he had come up with satisfies it for me anyway.
Mm-hmm. I think, Steve, and I appreciate you saying that. I did not make this clear, and I should have. A person can be an authoritarian and nationalist and not be a fascist.
Absolutely.
You have to be an authoritarian and nationalist in order to be a fascist, but it doesn't necessarily work in the other way. And I would say one of the distinguishing marks, and maybe this is just repeating somewhat you said, is a fascist is necessarily an ideologue. It's someone who has some sort of an ideological commitment to a certain set of principles that usually generate around the nation state or the glorious past or something to that degree.
Yeah, I mean, I spent more time on this than I normally would, because I think it is an interesting discussion. It's also one of those terms that just gets thrown around way too much and generally just means I don't like them. Like, that's really, like, that's what it boils down to. Most people, if you press them, because I've had this conversation with a lot of people that are more on the Trump derangement syndrome side of, like, I don't like Trump. Like, mm-hmm. I think he's a bad president, but I can list the reasons why. And I'm talking about, like, when I talk to people that immediately go to he's a fascist, and then I try to have them explain what that means, rarely can they define fascism. So I think it's pretty smart that we're going to do so. I mean, but the thing is, people, like, the historians can't agree on, like, there is not a great definition of it. And I think it's because, frankly, like, Nazism is, unfortunately, that is the one that's connected to it. But, like, Italian fascism was different in a lot of different ways. Including the racial aspect of, like, trying to exterminate the Jews. That was not something, the Jewish, the anti-Semitic stuff was not part of Italian stuff until later. And so what's weird about it, like, I think the two best definitions I've seen were, like, last year, this kind of all got brought up again because of the John Kelly thing. And then Kamala Harris just runs with it and starts calling Trump an actual fascist, which, I mean, I think all of us knew that wasn't going to work, because Democrats have called every Republican that ran for president in my lifetime a fascist. They've literally called them Nazis or fascists, whether it was Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush or Mitt Romney. Like, everyone's a fascist, everyone's a Nazi. And then they finally get a guy that might meet the definition, and it's the boy who cried wolf. But I think the best definition, frankly, after looking at all the different things, because John Kelly's thing was a far-right authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, and belief in a natural societal hierarchy. I think that works pretty well, but I think Jonah Goldberg's is better. fascism is a religion of the state, because the more and more you look into this stuff, if you don't have that religious aspect of like, this is the person that can save us from, I mean, there's always a savior mentality. There's always things are really bad. And so I think that's kind of the best version of it, because you have to have that religious part of it or it doesn't work. Because you could be describing communism on almost everything we just talked about too. It's not that much different. They pretend that it doesn't have that central part, but it does. They like to pretend it's the whole community, but it's not. Soviet Russia was not it was as autocratic as Germany was under Nazi regime, right? I mean, it was no different, in my opinion. Maybe that's too simplified, but
might not be all that different on a moral plane. I often draw distinctions in that the Marxists at least have the sort of workers of the world unite. And I think the true pure Marxists, which to be fair, in the Soviet Union, it didn't last very long.
Right. It just doesn't ever, that's like in theory, that's what they're saying, but it never can be that. Like it never does. You can't have that kind of thing implemented without some sort of strongman, you know, like Stalin killing people that say you can't do otherwise.
Well, there was a sort of notion, I think, prior, you know, right after World War I, the Bolsheviks, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution was that, in effect, why would we get involved in any of these wars? This is just the capitalists fighting each other.
Yeah.
And it, you know, that kind of got blown out of the water during World War II. But I think that's one of the on paper differences, shall we say, is that the Marxists tend to see themselves more as we're uniting around the class structure differences, whereas the fascists make no bones about that. It's not about class. It's about ethnicity or nation state or some other thing that they're saying, no, this is what the true authentic people is.
I think Marxists would have said fascism is end stage capitalism.
Yeah, you're right. But what's interesting to me is that when you like look at the list of things that they end up doing, or the list of ways people are oppressed, or any of those things, there's not a huge, you know, you're talking about, we start getting into definitional things that to me are really, they're sort of philosophical almost, and they're certainly very wonky. And the way it affects the actual citizens of those countries is much more like brutal and normal. It doesn't need to be this kind of but I think we just sometimes try to put too fine a pin on it. And some of that is because the best example we have is Nazi Germany. And, you know, I think that it probably, there are some people that say that it wasn't really fascism. You know, it's like the classic thing of like, well, it's never really been tried. You know, that's the whole thing with communism. So to me, sometimes we get into those things. I think all of those things are true, like Josh, anyone else said. Like, I think all that stuff is true. It's just that when you try to explain that to someone, or have someone explain that to you, because like I said, a lot of people come with me with like, well, Donald Trump's a fascist. I'm like, okay, explain what you mean first, because we got to define the term before we can actually have a discussion about it. And so many people just you know, they can't really define it. They just know that's the thing I'm supposed to say about things that I don't like. And so that's been sort of the frustrating thing, is that I do think he's, you know, we're not getting to that part yet, but even when there are overlaps, it's a knee-jerk reaction on the right to be like, well, you've called everyone a fascist and a Nazi, though. So it just makes it hard for me. Like, I feel like I'm supposed to reflexively defend the person now that is being accused of being a fascist, because for my whole life, that's what it's been like.
George Orwell said that basically fascism became synonymous with being a bully.
Yep. Yeah. It was the way to shut down an argument.
And I want to get Mike and John in here as well. I do want to say too, just as a tacit acknowledgement, like even to have a discussion like this, I think some people would find insulting. It's not so much to ask the question, is Donald Trump a fascist, that I don't think the question's off the table, because there's so many Americans that say that. So let's at least have a conversation. Okay, what do we mean by that, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you know, just it often just gets into sort of a shouting match of, you either denounce someone as a fascist, or you denounce the person because they're calling someone a fascist, and therefore you don't have to pay attention to them. But John and Mike, do you have any thoughts on this kind of this early stage here where we're laying the groundwork?
Yeah, definitely. You know, it brings the part of the discussion brings my memory back to a couple of weeks ago when I was watching, and many of you who may be familiar may have seen the same video that I've seen. Jubilee, you know, they have basically a 20 versus 1 setting where they have 20 people who would disagree with the one person who's in the center of the ring. Mehdi Hassan, the British American journalist, was chosen to be in the middle of the ring in this particular setting, surrounded by 20 far-right conservatives. But what he learned is that there were many people within that ring of conservatives who also struggled with the definition of not just conservatism, but also fascist. What is a fascist? There was actually a young man who named Connor who identified himself as a fascist after admitting that he did not believe in democracy. He said, "I prefer autocracy." And he said, "Well, what can I say?" And Mehdi Hasan says, "I think you could say I'm a fascist." He says, "Yeah, I am," just blatantly like that. And so what that moment revealed, for anyone who understands history or appreciates it, the hairs on the back of your neck really should have stood up, because it's very, fascism does not come, in a situation where it's announcing itself. It presents itself in convenience, where people say, well, as you were alluding to a little bit earlier in the show, Josh, there's a scapegoating of a certain demographic. It's this particular group's fault that we're in this particular economic situation or this particular cultural situation. And if we just get the right leader who's strong enough to put the screws to them, then our issue would be that much resolved. What's interesting about fascism is that it's not just politics you don't like. And of course, yes, the young man went ahead to lose his job and then also fundraise and get $15,000 from a Christian organization online because of that. But fascism isn't just politics you don't like. It's a system where a strong man fuses the state with his own personal power, glorifies violence. It divides society into loyalists and enemies, suppresses independent institutions like the press and universities. It weaponizes nationalism to justify it all. Mussolini put it bluntly. He said everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So that definition makes it clear that it's not about tax rates. It's not about foreign policy disagreements. It's about systemic dismantling of democracy in service of one man and one movement. And it's true. I do concede. I think Blake had a point there. The Democrats have used strong language against Republicans since Reagan. And sometimes that was overkill. But here's the difference. Reagan never tried to overturn an election he lost. George H.W. Bush never sent soldiers into American cities to patrol his critics. George W. Bush never ordered raids on his former national security advisor. Mitt Romney conceded the 2012 election within hours of losing. John McCain corrected a supporter of his who accused President Obama of being a Muslim. Why? Because they believed in democracy more than power. And that is worlds apart from what we're witnessing with the current occupant of the White House. So while rhetoric is important and we should be mindful of words, we also have to look at it with the backdrop of the actions. And so I think, the wolf, for the analogy of the boy who cried wolf, the wolf at the door. So yeah, in the past, Democrats saw shadows, but in Donald Trump, the wolf isn't a shadow. It's standing in front of us. And so if your child pulled the fire alarm, or for, some delinquent kid in the school pulled a fire alarm 3 times when there's no fire, but on the 4th time, there was actually a fire, would we ignore it? And that's the question America has to decide for itself. A lot of people have become numb to these terms, and we can understand that, think when terms are overused, especially in this internet phrase, there's certain phrases that become overused and they lose its power. But the question we have to start asking ourselves is, as we're starting to see what's going on in Washington, D.C., as we're seeing John Bolton lose his, get his house raided, and now Miles Taylor looks like he's next. As we're looking to see how, we had a president who met with an autocrat on U.S. soil. There was no ceasefire announced or any kind of peace agreement announced. But what was the takeaway was that Trump is taking Putin's advice to make it that much more harder to cast a ballot by targeting mail-in ballots. The alarm bells need to be going up. And, party hat aside, this is a very serious moment in American history. And if we're not careful, we'll be swept away just like many nations before. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But we've seen, nation after nation, who fell victim to fascism didn't do so with the full understand or full acknowledgement that that's what they were doing.
Mike, you're the comments are rolling in, but I want to give John an opportunity to, because he hasn't had a chance to speak yet. But after that, we'll post some comments here.
Well, I mean, in terms of wrapping up our definitions of fascism, there isn't really a whole lot more I can add. I think the only other thing of this has kind of been alluded to in other people's comments, that there seems to be a strong cult of personality associated with fascism, at least historically, and I think that does make a critical difference in terms of how effective fascism can overtake a country. But beyond that, I think, and again, I'm pretty much ready to just dive into the question at this point. While there are some things that, kind of, feel, fascist-y under a Trump administration, I do think there are some critical differences we have to acknowledge. For instance, I think, one of the biggest moves that people are alluding to with regards to whether or not Trump may be a fascist is the DC takeover, and it's, to be fair, I mean there's actually a law that he is abiding by that gives him the power to declare a 30-day emergency, to deploy national security and federal authorities to DC, and that's a critical difference. It's legal. Now when he talks about, doing the same thing in Chicago or Los Angeles or some other city, now, there, I'm not sure what law he would be relying on or what legal authority he would be relying on to execute that, because it's not the same thing as the District of Columbia, which is technically, a federal district. And then, the other thing that kind of made me laugh getting ready for this podcast, we talk about how much fascism relies on the centralization of authority and having a nationalist take on everything. I was actually pretty eager to make the argument that I don't think Trump is a fascist or does any fascist things. And then come Friday, I find out that the United States government has now taken a 10% interest in Intel, which I was like, wow, that's like, isn't that literally socialism? Like, I thought Republicans were supposed to be the anti-socialist party. That just doesn't feel right to me.
And U.S. Steel.
And U.S. Steel, yeah.
US Steel now, yeah. I mean, it's more and more, and Republicans are just totally quiet about it.
Yeah, that I have to admit that's not, that just doesn't feel right to me. Go ahead.
I'm posting here a comment. They're rolling in. Stephen Foster, very familiar name, if I'm not mistaken, Mike. I think we know him. John Kelly had it totally right. He says, my question is, how can ethnic racial nationalism and authoritarianism in combination be anything other than fascism? And he said he'll wait here. I don't want to dwell too much on this because I know we've got a lot to say, but I think it's important we define things as we can. Stephen, I was talking, and if anybody wants to add to it here, that I think I'm not saying I'm in any way for authoritarianism. Nationalism is okay depending on the context. I'm almost always against it, but there are instances when maybe one could argue it's not bad. But I think that fascism goes a step beyond that, in that it's a commitment to a particular political ideology that values a nation state. So an American fascist, for instance, I think would believe that there's something innate in our that because of our nationalism, we are superior somehow, and therefore it almost justifies waging war or at least subjecting others to servitude at some combination. I don't know if you gentlemen, and actually, I will post here because we had a response to Mr. Foster. Hot Wax 93. I think one of the best things about listener comments is the names we have here. Hot Wax 93, Stephen Foster. There may be some fringe extremists that are ethnic or racial nationalists, but Trump isn't, and most of MAGA isn't. They're just wrong. And then he goes on to say Trump is hardly the first president to weaponize the presidency against his political opponents: FDR, JFK, LBJ, Nixon, Obama. My only problem, Hot Wax, with your post here is you did not mention Woodrow Wilson, which is the obvious individual in that list. You can take everybody else off.
Someone that started it, maybe more than anyone.
And I'm going to pull that down for a moment because we have joining us our final panelists. Kent, it's good to have you tonight.
Thank you so much. It's was doing a little dance with musical theater. That's why I'm late.
Well, that's quite all right. We will we'll rope you into the conversation. We were trying to do some groundwork. Trying to define, well, what is fascism? Let's not even discuss, is Trump a fascist or isn't he? Is he a nationalist or isn't he? Like, what exactly is it? You've missed that part of the debate. We won't necessarily go back over it for the sake of the listener. But I am going to now open the floor up to the all hell breaks loose and the wheels fall off portion of the conversation. What do we think? Is Trump a fascist?
I did want to ask if there's somebody here more knowledgeable than I, and at least as knowledgeable as Josh. Maybe it's Josh, it's you. Since I'm not 135 years old, how is it that Woodrow Wilson weaponized the presidency?
Well, essentially, they were trying to crack down a lot of ways on the disagreement with World War I. He imprisoned, you guys can help me out here, is it Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate?
He imprisoned lots of journalists.
He imprisoned lots. He was the most famous, I guess, because he was a political opponent.
Okay.
Like outspoken against the Constitution, didn't think thought it was outdated, thought it should just run everything.
Yeah, he introduced taking photographs of individuals if they were going to work for the executive department as a means of trying to determine what the race was, so that he could specifically prevent black or other ethnic minorities from working. I mean, I think as somebody rightly put it, even for his day, Woodrow Wilson was extremely racist, even by the standards of the day. Not that racism in itself is fascism, but that'd be the main thing.
Were racist in the teens, by the way.
A lot of them were, but he, in a lot of ways,
but
was.
That guy was just terrible.
Yeah,
he was more extreme than a lot of the. The normal eugenics stuff was going on like across the board, like that was just a popular thing at the time. Most of the other people had started framing it in like they're not fit to reproduce, and normally they were trying to at least frame it as some sort of like mental deficiency or some sort of thing like that. Woodrow Wilson was just still really bitter about the South losing the Civil War and thought that that it was a bad deal that the South got in that whole thing, despite starting a civil war.
It's a really good question, and I should probably do an entire Woodrow Wilson bit because
to throw in, Josh, that one of the first major Hollywood blockbuster motion pictures, The Birth of a Nation, was released under his presidency, 1915.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a private screening at the White House and called it History Told Through Lightning. Of course, this was a skewed and inaccurate history because it portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes riding in to save the day from the black brutes. But this is the kind of picture of the man, just to add to what Blake was mentioning, that Woodrow Wilson was someone who was a Southern sympathizer through and through, although he was a Princeton University professor. And someone did mention in the comments the Espionage and Sedition Act. I think that was one of the first erosions of the First Amendment that we start to see. And I think, it's very characteristic of fascism and, even going back to authoritarianism, to really take a hatchet to First Amendment freedoms, the right to criticize the government, the right of the press to report accurately. And I think we're going to get to that a little bit later, but I just thought that the parallel is apt between, some of the things that we're seeing with the FCC and this administration, the Espionage and Sedition Act.
Woodrow Wilson is basically the first one that says the presidency is at the top of the executive branch, and therefore everything else should be subject to the top of the executive branch. He's kind of one of the first people that really starts viewing the presidency as sort of imperial, and that we can centralize everything, and really is like the door, kicking the door, putting his toe in for FDR to really do the New Deal and kind of all the stuff. So it certainly centralized the power of the executive branch.
And this stuff gets messy in a hurry, because I would not call FDR a fascist, even though
maybe
they both
not at all.
that same door. It's more the person. Yeah.
No, I just say, if I may, Josh, speaking of FDR, I was actually kind of transitioning this back into whether our topic of conversation of whether Trump is a fascist.
Yes, please do.
It's worth mentioning that Trump has now cut more executive orders than any other administration since FDR's first year in office. And, again, when we talk about centralization of authority, clearly he's not relying a lot on legislative solutions. Now, obviously, the hard political reality of that is that Congress is pretty divided. We have he has very narrow Republican control of the House, and doesn't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. So he has relied on, I mean, last I checked, it was about 180 executive orders thus far, which, like I said, is only second to FDR at this point. Now, is that necessarily, fascist? I will wait and see how all these executive orders shake out in the courts. Obviously, a lot of them are being challenged in the courts. You're seeing a lot of district judges impose nationwide injunctions on them. You're also seeing a fair amount of appellate courts overturning these district judges as being a little too broad with their legal conclusions. Once, for instance, his executive order on birthright citizenship gets before the U.S. Supreme Court, I'll be very curious to see how the court shakes out on that. But so while on the one hand you could say some of these moves sound a little fascistic, there are still plenty of checks and balances, I think, being checked on the executive. Or we're in a situation, like I said, with the federal takeover of DC, where he actually is relying on a law that enables him to do that, at least for 30 days.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the problem for Trump has been he makes a move. Well, first of all, let's just go back to this point. Do any of us really believe that Donald Trump has a coherent political ideology? I mean, does anyone think that I don't. I mean, I don't. That's what's hard about this conversation too, is that I think Trump is literally just what is good for me, what gets me the good headline. And I think that's about as far as he gets down the road on this stuff. I think on a lot of these executive orders, they look like they're designed to get struck down by the courts, almost to be like, I got the headline. And look, every president is doing this now. They go, well, I'm going to sign this executive order because Congress won't do anything. And then when the courts come back and say, I can't do that, I get to blame the courts for your problems. And so I tried to help you guys out. Biden did this with student loans. I really think it's almost this way to pretend to be doing things. And I don't think Donald Trump really expects the birthright citizenship thing to work. I think it's pretty obvious. There's no way that's constitutional. I think it's the same thing with the voting stuff you talked about earlier. The executive branch has zero control over state voting laws. Zero. He cannot tell a state what to do at all. Congress can to some degree on federal stuff, but Donald Trump doesn't seem to care to even ask Congress to do something. So I don't think he has a real political ideology other than I want to be in charge. I want to be the person that people have to come to. I think that's why he loves the tariff so much. It's like, you don't want Congress to do it because then people could go lobby Congress. He wants people to come lobby him. So I think that's the hardest part about this conversation is that I don't think Donald Trump really has a political ideology. I think Hitler did. I think Mussolini did. I think Stalin did. And I don't think Donald Trump is one of those people. Is that fair?
I would add one thing to that in that whether or not he has an ideology, I think that what Hitler and Mussolini and some of the others did is they recognized the inherent strengths or weaknesses of the system as it was, and they did everything within their power with a great deal of patience and cunning to destroy it. Now, to a degree, one could say Trump has done that, January 6th being maybe Exhibit A. But there does seem to be a great deal of lack of focus, initiative, effort.
Patience, like you said.
Yeah, patience, right.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that necessarily as an excuse for Trump. It's just, it seems that it's one thing if we have a fascist regime and Trump is the next guy in charge. I don't think he's going to be a George Washington and return us, say, to, a free republic. It's quite another thing to say that, well, is he a Hitler or a Mussolini who is actively working to try to dismantle the democratic system with great vigor and resolve. And some may disagree with that, but that's part where I'm saying it's not. I don't think it's a good thing. I would much rather have a leader in which, if he were in charge of a dictatorship, would want to move it toward a democracy.
But I think it can be a good thing that someone doesn't have patience or an attention span when they do have the bad instincts. And I think he does have the authoritarian instincts and potentially even fascistic, if we want to get into that. But I don't think that he has the follow through to actually be the threat that some people make him out to be.
So I'll say, Blake, I agree with you in that I did make a note to myself. It's 4 words: Trump is missing ideology. But I'm reminded of a long form essay I read a couple of years ago about Argentina's Perón. And it was asking the same question. Was he a fascist? And it went down the list, right? Authoritarian, check. Strong centralized government, check. Ultranationalist, check. He disappeared people, check. People died, check. He was reactionary and opposed dissent, check. Basically, the thesis of this essay was he a fascist? Probably not. Does it matter? Nope. Because basically every action he took was that of a fascist. So I think that's kind of where I come down with the current administration with Donald Trump, is that you're right. His ideology is Donald Trump. and I think he goes to where the fire's at, and he fans it. There was a book I read a couple of years ago called Hitler in Nazi Germany: A History, where it discussed a lot of, and I thought it was pretty. I thought it was pretty well done, and I thought it was pretty convincing that Hitler was 75% of the way there in a lot of his stuff, but the other 25% was he was stoking something that was already going on in Germany at the time. And so, yes, there was anti-Semitism, extreme xenophobia, really more than just anti-Semitism. It was anyone that they were afraid of, right? Or what were the perception of who was taking our jobs, who was in charge. Just happened to be Jewish people that they perceived to be in charge of the bank. So, but it could have been anyone of dark skin, or I mean, it ended up being Ukrainians, it ended up being Russians, right? It wasn't just Jewish people. But I think the bottom line is, we're talking about, is he a fascist? Is he not? The actions he's taking are as harmful as a fascist actions would be. And I think, when Josh, when you first broached the subject of like, is he a fascist? Okay, it's a little clickbaity, whatever. I think the bottom line was, it doesn't really matter if he checks all of those boxes of being a fascist. The outcome is that of a fascist authoritarian.
I want to jump in if I could, because I got to disagree with John a little bit, because when we look at fascists and authoritarians, they almost always operate through laws, at least at first. They don't start by burning constitutions; they weaponize them. You look at Germany, and Hitler rose legally. He passed the Enabling Act lawfully, and then dismantled democracy step by step. And then you look at Hungary. Viktor Orban relied on constitutional amendments and court rulings to hollow out his democracy, which were all technically legal. Turkey, Erdogan used emergency decrees grounded in law to crush his opposition. In Thailand, courts nullified elections under the guise of legality. So to me, the fact that Trump points to a statute or a court order and says, well, I have the power to weaponize the National Guard to take over DC. That doesn't make it democratic, because Hitler had laws, Orban had laws, Erdogan had laws. The defining feature of authoritarianism isn't breaking laws, it's bending them to destroy the system from within.
Yeah, I do think, though, so far he has not really done that in a degree where, when the courts have come back and told him, no, you can't do that, they have eventually gone along with it. I mean, that's my one defense, is that and maybe that's just because he doesn't have the follow through, but when he has tried to do something that's questionable legally, so far, like, we'll see, like with the DC thing, if he refuses to take the National Guard out after 30 days, then it's like, well, okay, then he's ignoring the order. Now he may just come up with another dumb emergency, but so far that hasn't. There's been plenty of things that concern me, and like it happens almost every day that there's something where I'm like, even though he has the legal authority to do this, I think it's authoritarian. Right. But like the difference has been, for the most part, when the judges come back, he just rails on them, but he doesn't actually not obey the order. That is the whole thing. And so that's kind of
that is a critical difference. I've noticed. I mean, again, I'm someone who's a card-carrying member of the Federalist Society, a lawyer by trade, and I've been following all these cases very closely as well. And yes, if any court does rule against them, yes, he rails against them on Truth Social and whatnot. But in terms of action-wise, they do abide by the ruling until they appeal it and wait for the appellate court or wait for the Supreme Court to weigh in. I also just wanted to point out one critical difference with all the examples that Mike laid out, which is while most of the guys he talked about, Erdogan and Orban and all these guys, they've all been in power for quite a long time now. Erdogan, I think, is just was past the 20-year mark. Obviously, Trump is term limited. Yes, he they do all these, they sell these dumb Trump 2028 hats. I think it's a joke. Some people are taking it much more seriously, and think that he is seriously trying to threaten a third run, even though, again, constitutionally, I don't see how that's possible.
I think he's serious.
You really do.
I
really?
do.
Interesting.
I think that he's, at least he likes the troll, but this is how Trump does everything. He throws it out there and they claim it's just a joke. It was the same thing with the stolen election stuff in 2020. He's always testing things as a joke, or testing things as, I'm just kidding around and I just like to get the other side riled up. And it's really like a
some people are saying.
Yeah, some people say, and it's a trial. To me, it's over and over again been a trial balloon that he sees what the reaction is. And sometimes the reaction is bad enough that he goes, oh, never mind. That's not a good trial balloon. I mean, like, look, he technically got scared in 2016 into picking Federalist judges because of the Access Hollywood tape. He realized like that scared him enough that he started listening to Republican advisors that were like, you have to do something that shows people that you're actually one of them. And that's the only reason he had to go that route of like saying, here's the Federal Society judges I will pick, because people were really doubting if this guy could really be conservative. I mean, I think it's hilarious because this guy has never claimed to be conservative. But so, I mean, that will be where I'm between probably Mike and Josh here, is that he does a lot of things where it's like, oh, I'm just kidding around. But then he follows through on them sometimes in ways where it's like to me, January 6th, not really January 6th, November to January 6th is all I ever need to know that Donald Trump is too authoritarian to give power, because he tried to steal an election. And now he didn't have the follow through on it. And he did listen to the courts that told him, and he did eventually leave office, but not for a lack of trying. And what concerns me now is less that is Trump a fascist? And the question that is bothering me more and keeping me up at night is like, how many Americans are okay, like that person on the Jubilee thing, that are like, I am welcoming the authoritarian fascist. And if I have to be a fascist to say, I would love this strongman who I worship and adore because we've replaced religion with politics for some reason in this country. That's what concerns me, is like, when will he throw a trial balloon up that enough Americans are fascist enough to go, yeah, we like this idea.
Hold on, just two quick things. One, I've also noticed that Tricky does as well, where he's always,
I'm not the only one saying that. Other people are saying it too.
Really, who else is saying it?
Other people.
Okay. The second thing, I'll say this: if Trump is serious about running for a third term and actually tries to do it in 2028, I might concede he might actually be a fascist. Go ahead.
Can I just say it confuses me, the very idea of Trump, quote unquote, running for a third term. I mean, what does that even mean? There's not a single state in the union who would put him on the ballot.
You don't think the Republican Party would?
It's not a matter of the Republican Party putting him on the ballot. The state itself cannot put him on the ballot. He's constitutionally ineligible. And when a state tries to do it, they'll get sued. And we do not have 5 Supreme Court justices who will allow him on the ballot. He can't run. The only thing he can do is, and this is a genuine fear because of who he is installing in the top echelon of the military, he can stay, but he can't run.
I wanted to add in
maybe, I don't know, we've never seen it tried, so it's hard,
to Blake's point, if someone tried to murder me and they didn't succeed, and they joke about killing me tomorrow or even a year from now, I'm not going to at that point give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think it's amazing to me how much folks are still willing to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt. His policy person, his policy brain, Steve Bannon, is very serious about this. He says Donald Trump will be inaugurated on January 20th, 2029. This is the man that Donald Trump had in his inner circle, not just in the first term, but even during a little bit during the 2024 campaign. He was actually playing more of a de facto a PR person for him on the podcast circuit. And so I'm taking him seriously.
And I've been very shocked how many Trump supporters I've heard say he deserves a third term. Like literally are campaigning for, well, yeah, because he didn't get 2 consecutive terms and because the 2020 election was stolen, which is all BS, obviously. Mm-hmm. But, what's weird about Trump is that because it's a religion, because it is, MAGA is a religious cult, and there's no other way to describe it. And look, technically, I think Obama had some religious culty stuff too, for sure. You give a guy a Nobel Peace Prize for doing nothing, it feels cultish. But the problem is that like that line in the sand that John talked about is always moving for MAGA cultish, because the thing is today, or 8 years ago, they would have said, well, yeah, of course not. I'm not going to support someone that runs for a third term unconstitutionally. And then they eventually justify it because Trump will give them a justification for it. He will make up another emergency, which is all presidents do now. By the way, everything that ever is authoritarian has to have some sort of crisis attached to it. So it might be the economy that he's already, it could be his economy that he tanks, and then that's the emergency, but he will find an emergency. That's his favorite thing to do is, oh, we've got an emergency in DC. Let's send the National Guard. We got an emergency in LA. Everything's an emergency power that Congress foolishly gave the presidency at some point without thinking about what if someone abuses this power.
So Blake, I want to interject here because I think that while this is a great discussion, if there are individuals listening, and I hope that they are, who would consider themselves to be MAGA, consider themselves to be Trump supporters, and are probably fuming at some point. Here we've got 6 people beating up on this guy that I voted for and I think is a great American, and you're calling him Hitler? This is ridiculous. It's not so much I'm... I don't want to back down what I say or believe, but I want to be careful about how what I'm saying is coming across people. And Blake, I'm looking at you in particular because you live just down the road from me. We're both in sunny Oklahoma.
Yeah,
and probably everybody on this panel could say this, but I know you could say this. We got a lot of friends and relatives that voted for Trump.
Yeah, and I have this conversation with a lot of them because I'm very red state.
Right. And I would assume the vast majority of them we would not describe as fascist or authoritarian adjacent. We would describe them as individuals who genuinely think Donald Trump is right in the Republican line of Ronald Reagan, of Abraham Lincoln. He's a good old American. He's trying to fight wokeist extremism. He's fighting the socialists. He's trying to put us on the right course. Never in a million years would they think this guy's an authoritarian or that he tried. January 6th, that was an effort to save democracy. We weren't trying to destroy democracy. And so I guess I'm wondering how, because I completely agree with you. One of my great fears is how many people are like that Jubilee crowd where they're, I'm a fascist, I'm an authoritarian, that's what I want. I'm also concerned with, how many Americans are out there that they're not fascist? They're not at all. They don't support this, but they think that Donald Trump is, that he is in effect the protector or defender of democracy. Where do we, because part of the problem there is, and you'll have to, some of the panels here have to forgive me for saying this, but I don't see that the Democratic Party has been exactly pure as the wind-driven snow in a lot of this stuff, that they've had their own excesses in recent history and even in the past, you can forgive an individual for saying, well, wait, if we're not for Trump, are we for the Democrats? What are we talking about there? So what message would we hope to convey to an individual? I'm trying to put it this way. They're not going to agree with you on, say, your opposition to Trump. But how would you hope that they could at least say, okay, I understand the dangers of authoritarianism, even in a free society. I see now these are the red flags to look for with an individual. Maybe I still like Trump's policies, but I can understand why you're concerned and why that might even be a concern I should share.
I don't know that you can until it affects them personally, until one of these policies hits home. Someone they know, a loved one, someone they trust. Other than that, I don't see how anything changes. I mean, that's kind of maybe a little defeatist of an attitude, and I'll own that. But to me, I don't see how you convince your cousin at Thanksgiving dinner who believes that Donald Trump is protecting democracy on January 6th, that he's anything but a warrior for his own personal cultural beliefs, until it's his wife that gets deported because it turns out her parents weren't from here, and so she was illegal or something like that.
But
that's
not even that.
That's the only time. Well, it's still an if.
Yeah.
It's still a big if.
There are a number of cases where they've interviewed people who voted for Trump. They are married or engaged to an immigrant who may or may not have had legal status. She gets snatched up, disappeared, and that guy is still on the train.
I think it's a pride thing at this point. I think that it's too hard for people to admit that they were wrong. I think it's silly that we put that much stock in a politician because they should work for us. And that's the way I think of things, is like, I'm sending you there, but this is essentially the next election will be another job interview. And I'm either going to say you can keep the job or I'm going to hire someone else. That's how we should think of it. But I think most people have turned into the team sport religion version of politics. And this, by the way, this is the same on the left. This is really not Donald Trump has a unique hold on the MAGA sort of right, like the really and I'm not everyone, by the way, that voted, didn't be totally clear for Josh's sake. if you voted for Trump, that doesn't make you a MAGA cult loyalist. But you know who I'm talking about is the people who can never say something bad about him. They can never admit that something's wrong. They can never even admit that when yesterday they agreed with him on the thing he said yesterday, but now it's the opposite of that. Because it's turned into Trump knows all. I just trust him. And what I normally, my pushback is always, okay, but what do you care about? Okay, do you want AOC to have that power in 2029 when she's the president? And then they're like, oh, well, I was like, well, then that's when you should care about authoritarianism or the executive branch having too much power. Is like, you think of the worst person you can think. I know you like Donald Trump right now, but think of someone else who you don't trust with that same power. And no one's ever given me a good answer for why they're okay with Donald Trump having powers that they're not okay with Biden or Obama or President AOC or whoever it may be in the future.
I hate to be
We don't
that
have to
guy, but Barack Obama had the Senate, the House, the White House, and we couldn't tie our own shoes. Okay, so we don't really, the idea that we're all going to bond together and do something is like, well, that would be great, but we've never been able to do that. So I've never had the same concerns, I guess, the left, because we've never been good enough to get together on something like that.
If the Democrats were dictatorial and if the Democrats were fascistic, we'd have free healthcare. We'd have no guns. They would just have done things, but they're constrained by the law. It's not.
I disagree with that a little bit. I think Biden did plenty of stuff that was way outside the law. I don't think the Democrats are as law abiding. I again, to plug Jonah Goldberg, his book Liberal Fascism goes into a lot of there's more fascism on the left, especially in the 19-teens, 1920s, than there ever was on the right. We started associating with the right, but there's as much of that authoritarian string. We know what's good for you. They might do it via the law, but I mean, like guns, like you said, they try to take them all away, but it's for your good. There's always
but at least in Biden's case, he had a Supreme Court to check him, right? When he tried to interfere with private property rights with the eviction moratorium, the court overturned him. When he tried to impose a vaccine mandate on hundreds of millions of Americans, the court overturned him. When he tried to wipe away $430 billion worth of student loan debt overnight with the stroke of a pen, the court overturned him, right? So there's still checks and balances in place. I'm still firmly confident that there are checks and balances in place in the Trump administration as well. I think there have been plenty of, again, not to name drop again, but Federalist Society judges who have shown that they're not a rubber stamp to anything Trump wants. I mean, I think the 2020 election aftermath demonstrated that pretty loud and clear. Only other thing I just want to add real quick, I think part of the appeal that Trump has with a lot of people who aren't, ideologically motivated or think he's, protecting democracy, I think they just view him as someone who just gets stuff done. I especially in all the swing states last year, I think people were very exhausted with, an open border where literally millions of people were just walking into the country and they just wanted something done about it. Right. And Trump has obviously demonstrated that, with 180 executive orders and counting, he's someone who, is just trying to get stuff done. This was part of the appeal of FDR back in the 1930s. They wanted a president who would take bold action and be an active executive. And that's probably why Trump has cut more EOs than any other president since FDR.
I want to add in a little bit because I you'd be surprised, Josh. I actually do have family members who voted for Donald Trump. I agree with what Blake had said about it being about pride. I think at this point, look, we're 8 months in. Donald Trump promised to be a dictator on day one. People laughed, and we've seen since January the 20th of this year things that are diametrically different from what we've seen Obama, Bush, Clinton, Bush 41, Reagan. So what I'm saying is, even to your point, Josh, about the Biden being, checked by the courts, we have a commander-in-chief and his administration who deliberately ignored court orders. And I think we need to wake up and realize while we're making these comparisons, we can't muddy the water so much that people don't see a clear distinction. The Supreme Court is the ultimate, check on in terms of determining or interpreting what the law is. And when you have a president that's willing to just steamroll over that, everyone should be able to put their partisan hat off and say, this is not right. This is not normal. And so while we're making the, historical connections about who was more fascist, the question I have is who quoted Viktor Orban on the debate stage as an authority as to why I should be elected for another term. It was Donald Trump who stood on the debate stage and said Viktor Orban is someone who I have their endorsement.
Yeah.
To me, that was like, what are we doing here? This is a man who has deliberately gone after his press, who makes no bones about. I mean, and Donald Trump met with him privately in the course of that 2024 campaign. And so I think it's abundantly clear when we're looking at the evidence and the receipts, where this is heading. And so just the fact that we didn't get there yet doesn't mean that we need to ignore the attempts.
Totally.
January 6th was, what many people call a dress rehearsal, because the ultimate goal was to have alternate slates of electors, which Peter Navarro called the Green Bay sweep, right? If Donald Trump, say we're in November of 2028 and say he's not running, but if he determines, hey, look, the election's too close, for the sake of the country, I'm going to stay in office indefinitely until we figure this out. That I wouldn't put that past him. And I don't think anyone should at this point. And so, just as we're, talking about these things, I think people, need to be able to realize that there are policy differences. Yes, there's some policy goals, but then you look at folks like the Cheneys. If I ever thought that I would be voting for the same candidate as a Cheney, I would tell you're lying. But the Cheneys recognize this threat, right? And not just them, but you got folks like Adam Kinzinger, right? You got folks who were ringing the alarm bells, and what was the cost of them doing so? They were thrown out of political power, right? They still have their platforms. I think Liz Cheney's working in University of Virginia, and Adam Kinzinger has whatever he's got going on. But that's the cost. And I think that's those are things that we need to observe, because I even heard some, folks in the comments and, making comparisons with Obama. And I said, look, Obama had a, fanatic, group of people who supported him. Yes. But even in his support group, there are people who would say, Obama, I didn't agree with this. Even today, there are people that say, well, I didn't agree with how Obama waited until Friday to endorse Harris, or I didn't agree with Obama as a party leader, or but the fact that anyone who says I disagree with Trump on anything is subject to lose their job, and not even lose their job, but lose their security clearance, like John Bolton, says a lot.
No, not security clearance. He lost his Secret Service detail, right. And he has credible threats on him from Iran. Same people are trying to kill him, Trump. And you would think that Trump would sympathize because he was one of the 3 people they were trying to kill, but no. Yeah, I agree.
I feel like I'm in any group put in an awkward situation of trying to defend the position I don't necessarily hold because others express my position too strongly, say. Mike, my concern with the way you're expressing this is we had a test of trying to run that message. We had the Liz Cheneys. We had the Adam Kinzingers. We had the Trump is a fascist. This is the election to save democracy. We already had that test with the American people, and it failed miserably. And I part of the reason of even having this sort of conversation tonight is I think there is a grave danger in not learning a lesson from that and trying to say, okay, why is it if individuals, and I'll express, I don't think Trump is a fascist. I would say authoritarian. I would say a nationalist. Maybe we're splitting hairs. I certainly don't support Trump, and I think he is very clearly a danger to the democratic project of the United States. But I also recognize that just trying to double down on everything, putting soldiers in Washington D.C., that's just what Hitler did or something. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but this sort of knee-jerk reaction from the opposition to consistently paint everything as Nazi-esque, if you will, in my view, has very clearly demonstrated itself to be completely ineffectual. And so I think it's needful to be cautious, to recognize, wait a minute, maybe just touting those Republicans who have stood up against Trump and have paid the price for it. Maybe that's not actually winning friends and influencing people. Maybe that's not converting anybody. Maybe there's something deeper we're missing about what people are complaining about, that they could be reached in some manner, but that's not the way to reach them.
And I want to go back because you mentioned also, the Democrats not being the best fighters for democracy. And I think, listen, when folks see folks fighting for something, we saw, for instance, a few weeks ago, the Texas delegation for the state legislatures departing, using a constitutional tool, which was a quorum break, to prevent the redistricting of Texas maps that would severely undermine and take away power from Black and Brown Texans. Democratic poll after Democratic poll showed huge nationalist support for that effort, and disapproval for the fact that after 2 weeks you're just going back. You know, you got our hopes up. You said you're going to fight, and now you're caving in. It seems. I think there's a reason why Gavin Newsom is also on the come up, and it's not because of his. It's because of the fact that he's finally one of the only Democrats that look like they have a backbone to say, enough of this whole kind of, well, if they do this, we're if we get power again, then they're going to be more powerful. No, he's like, no, forget that. I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to redraw these maps, period. People are getting behind it. When people see folks fighting, then the 90 million people who stayed home in 2024 start to wake up and say, there's something worth fighting for. People want to join a fighting campaign. And to the point of John, I think that's what attracted a lot of people to Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a fighter. Donald Trump looked like he was taking it to the liberals in the deep state, up into the point where now the Epstein files require his disclosure, and he's got the very folks who were demanding transparency on their podcasts are now holding the vote. But the fact that you have the Democrats really looking like they're taking a new leaf here as it pertains to the fight for democracy, it's galvanizing people in a way that I don't think we've seen it probably since 2018. And so I think that is probably what was lacking. I mean, we can do both. We can talk about policy, but another element we also have to consider is the fact that we've heard, as you were saying before, Blake, the language used over and over. Fascist was used as a term against Republicans before. We cannot get complacent, right? We can't let people get complacent with these terms. We've got to show them directly how these authoritarian actions are having an impact on their life. And so, people say, well, how does the DC takeover impact my life? Well, when you look at Project 2025, page 555 on the bottom paragraph, you see that this is exactly what they were saying was going to happen. Anyone who has any question about what's next, all you have to do is look at the playbook they provided you, and you'll see how this lines up and how this will impact you personally if you live in DC, if you go to school in DC, if you teach in DC, or if you live in the metropolitan area. And forget that, that's just that particular action, but other actions that this administration has taken since resuming power.
Josh, I think you hit on something either on purpose or just you grazed it, and I think it's the most important point here.
It was clearly an accident.
Clearly an accident. I'm going to circle back to Roger Griffin. He wrote, for its radicalization into a revolutionary movement to occur and gain traction within a wide body of the public, what is needed is a liberal state undergoing a structural crisis of identity, meaning, and belonging. All that to say, whether Trump is a fascist or not is less important than the fact that I think a great number of Americans are ready for a fascist. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the most important thing. And that's what I fear, because Donald Trump is elderly, out of shape. He probably won't get a third term. He try to stay, maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't really matter. The fact is that his time is almost at an end on this planet, okay? But the people that voted for him, that are believers, they're going to be around. And they're ready for this kind of leader. And that's what scares me more than a single individual comes and goes, right? Donald Trump came, Donald Trump's going to leave. Like I said earlier, I don't even know what his ideology is, except for that he likes himself a lot and he thinks that he should be in charge because he's the most important person. But the fact is that there's a number of people, a large number of Americans who want that. And they're going to look for it in the next person, and then the next person, and the next person. Maybe some of them are going to be on the left, and maybe the left will get their act together and actually put down their winning the right way mentality and start saying we just want to win. And maybe they will, I don't know. But I think my fear is that too many Americans are ready for a fascist.
I think we're giving Democrats way too much credit. I think there's as many, they wouldn't think of themselves as fascistic, but I think there's as many people that want that, because the excuse I hear all the time for both Donald Trump and Biden before him and Obama before him is, well, Congress won't do anything, so someone has to do something. And that's always the excuse for these illegal executive orders. And so it's just excused constantly. As long as you've got the right letter after your name and that's on my side, then authoritarianism is fine. And I hear people say in that Jubilee thing, it's exactly what he said. Well, you know, I'm okay with one person fixing the problems. We get to a point where we get so exhausted with the problems that we go, I will take dictatorial. We got people talking about the monarchy now on the right. We've got people saying we should go back to having kings. It's crazy, but you're right. That's what concerns me the most. I'm absolutely with you.
I'm convinced at this point. It's the same with spending in the debt. I mean, frankly, each side only gets outraged when it's the other side spending.
Yeah, that's a
But
great
then,
point.
again, once they're in power, they blow it out blow it out the wazoo too.
Yeah, and especially once you combine that tendency that I think we're already there with, and I think that there's been a history of that too, because like our system of government is unnatural. It's like really not natural. People are swinging back to that desire for having one person just in charge of everything, which is, I don't know why they like it. I guess they're just short memory of history, but I don't know. It does concern me a lot when people are asking for it. And that's what concerns me most about Trump. Like I said, I'm now hearing people go, he should get a third term, or and you just go, you understand that if someone said that about Barack Obama, you would have lost your mind. And yet you're here literally already trying to lay down the track so that you can excuse it when it happens. That boggles my mind.
I think this is, and we're getting close to, I don't think we're anywhere near resolving this issue, but we are getting close to needing to wrap up. So I'm going to give each of you gentlemen an opportunity for some closing thoughts, if you would like to. I appreciate you saying that, Blake. I think that is something I am always concerned about, because there's nothing about having an R or a D next to your name that makes you a better or worse person necessarily, even though the parties themselves can do things and the specific leaders that represent those parties can do things that are, say, better or worse in certain periods of time. I think you hit on it very well. And so what we talk about, of course, saving elephants all the time, where our system is not natural. If it were natural, it would have showed up 10,000 years ago rather than just, in the last couple hundred years. We're doing something that grates against our natural human instincts to want to live in tribes or monarchies or have some central authority. That is not a Democrat tendency. That is not a Republican tendency. That is a human tendency. Thank God we have institutions, we have history that helps us grate against that very natural instinct, but it is something that we're perfectly capable of. So I do want to give each of you gentlemen an opportunity, I guess, as we're signing off, what your hopes or concerns, if there's anything you feel like that we have not said yet. It sounds like a lot of us are in agreement that the threat itself is not Trump per se. Is he or isn't he a fascist? But are we ripe as a nation for moving more and more toward welcoming in that sort of authoritarian leader that would be the complete destruction of what we as a people have always been?
Well, the idea, I think Blake, you had said about we just want someone to get it done. I don't think our government was designed to get stuff done. It was designed to be very slow, a lot of agreement, or at least deals being made. That was the design of the government. And I think we as a people, after a couple of hundred years, said, I'm tired of this. Now, I think you're the most pious of us want that bold, smart, wise philosopher king to make all the right decisions, with no one in mind but the people, and then go off to like Cincinnatus or something to go back and sweep away his porch when he or she is done. I think that this idea that we're going to go back in time and be okay with everything moving slowly is gone. I don't know how we go back. Whether if you're on the left, you're saying, how do we go back? How do we if we can't get people health care, if we can't make sure that people are of all creeds, ethnicities, are welcomed, if we can't get that the democratic way, then we have to go this way. And if you're on the other side, well, if we can't get spending down, if we can't get abortions to be made illegal across the country, if we can't do that the right way, well then I guess we're going to have to. And I think that while I agree with the at the end of the day, if a liberal monarchy looks like everyone's got health care and yeah, of course I'm more okay with that because that's more on my side. But yeah, I just don't think that we want to go backwards to a slow moving government. We want someone who's going to get stuff done. If it's Gavin Newsom on our side, I don't know, but I think we're going to be more open to it because we see the alternative and we don't like that. So we're ready to go with that guy, even though that's not the way that we may want it in a perfect world. We're ready to do it now.
I just want to say I echo everything Steve said about our system of government and how it came to be and the dangers of abandoning that principle. And actually, it reminds me of a great quote, and this is what I'll end on, from Walter Bagehot, who was the editor-in-chief of The Economist from 1860 to 1877. I've always appreciated this. It goes, quote, "The best reason why monarchy is a strong government is that it is an intelligible government. The mass of mankind understand it, and they hardly anywhere else in the world understand any other. It is often said that men are ruled by their imaginations, but it would be truer to say that they are governed by the weakness of their imaginations. The nature of a constitution, the action of a legislature, the play of parties, the unseen formation of a guiding public opinion are complex facts, difficult to know and easy to mistake. But the action of a single will, the decree of a single mind, are easy ideas to comprehend. Anybody can predict them. No one can ever forget them. When you put before the mass of mankind the question, will you be governed by a king or will you be governed by a constitution? The inquiry comes out as thus: will you be governed in a way you understand or will you be governed in a way you do not understand? I think there's something in our lizard brains that, keep reverting back to this sort of monarchical rule because it's just a simpler way to understand. And obviously our system of government, our constitutional republic, is a very complex system of government, and that's why people get frustrated with inaction and bold, singular, unitary action from an executive. It really is appealing to a lot of people on all sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, I'd say, like, to answer the question in the shortest form, I do think Donald Trump, if he had a magic or had a rubbed a lamp and a genie came out and offered him to be a fascistic dictator, I think he'd be like, absolutely, I'd love to do that. And I think that it would have to be that easy. So it's like, I think he probably is. I mean, all the definitions we've talked about, I think he checks them. I think he is populist. I think he's nationalist. I think he's authoritarian. I think he certainly believes that he's a savior. Like, I think he buys into the cult thing. I think 100%. And I think he would take that, but he doesn't concern me as much as, gosh, what if someone that was a little smarter, a little more ambitious, and also had that cult of personality? The tricky part there is that I don't think anyone's going to be able to recreate the stranglehold he has on the GOP. I find it very hard to believe that, like, Steve Bannon can do that. But it concerns me because, like I said, it seems like there's an appetite in America for authoritarianism at the very minimum. I mean, whether we want to go to full on fascism or whatever, but like on the left and on the right, people seem to be begging for authoritarianism. They want one person that goes in there and does whatever they think is necessary, including packing courts, if that's what's necessary, including shredding the Constitution, if that's what's necessary. Doesn't matter if it's illegal. If they believe that their goals are good and fighting the right enemy, they're for it. And that is what scares the ever living hell out of me, because I do not trust Americans right now. I don't.
As we're drawing to a close, I think oftentimes folks, every time there's a person who wins an election or a party that wins an election, the pundits over exaggerate the genius and the strategy behind how they won, and they exaggerate how the losers lost. But when we look at 2024, nearly half the country, yes, voted for Trump, but he won by a margin of just 1.5 percentage points, one of the smallest in modern history. So that razor thin result gives me two truths, right? First, democracy's stake is a warning that didn't land, like you mentioned, Josh, the way many thought it would. But the second truth is that, there are a lot of people who actually did feel as if it was worth their time to come out, to come off their couches and to vote. And what that tells me is that, reminding people of what's at stake, how precious it is to have a democratic form of government where we can disagree and yet not have to worry about rigged elections or tanks in the streets, is something that can still resonate with people. But not at the neglect, of course, of their personal day-to-day needs. Some Americans say, as was mentioned before about the effectiveness of authoritarianism. Some Americans say, Trump is strong-handed, but at least he'll get things done. I wouldn't invite him for dinner, but hey, I'm tired of the gridlock, and we need a strong man. I understand the frustration, but democracy is slow. It's frustrating. It forces compromise. And the reality is that authoritarians promise efficiency, but what they actually deliver is corruption, repression, incompetence, wrapped in what seems to be strength. Orban in Hungary promised efficiency. What did he deliver? Cronyism. Erdogan in Turkey promised order. He delivered purges and economic collapse. Putin in Russia promised greatness. And Russians only got a broken economy, and now they're in a war that's isolating them on the world stage. So authoritarianism, efficiency, is efficient only at one thing, and is dismantling your rights. And once you trade liberty for speed, you lose both of those things. So,
or safety, by the way.
Right.
I mean, that's because that's the other famous thing that people will say that you can trade. It's like you can trade your freedom for safety, and people are willing to do that almost every time.
Yeah, and it's true. When Donald Trump's this is not conservatism. That's another thing that I wanted to point out. None of this is conservative. Authoritarian. This is authoritarianism with an American accent. We talked about the militarization of Washington D.C. We talked about the weaponization of the FBI against folks like Bolton and Taylor and whoever else may be next. We talked about, we didn't get into it much, but we alluded to the using the FCC to intimidate CBS and NPR and PBS while protecting Fox. Threatening universities like Harvard. And defunding them if they criticize the administration. This is exactly the slow motion suffocation of democracy that's described in a friend of mine, Harvard professor Steve Levitsky's The Tyranny of the Minority, not with tanks in the streets, but with laws bent into weapons, institutions captured, and norms abandoned. So how should Americans respond is the question. We should respond with clarity, with commitment, with courage, and we need to have a clarity to call Trumpism what it is. It's authoritarianism, not efficiency. Even folks today, they'll say, well, I didn't vote for this, right? and the adage, a broken clock is right twice a day came to mind when Donald Trump was pressed about that same question. He said, actually, you did vote for this because there was a playbook. None of this was a surprise. It shouldn't have been. They put out a book about this, Project 2025. So, folks who say, well, I voted for lower prices. I voted for, more affordable cost of living and everything like that. I think that they're recognizing that when you prioritize these short-term, and I'm not in any way trying to dismiss these concerns, because look, I understand, but when we prioritize short-term benefits and expense of whether or not we can have a system anymore, we see that there are dire consequences, the likes of which will take years to recover from.
Well, I guess I'm last. Am I last? I got here late, so I haven't had as much time to sit with all of this as the rest of you. So I don't have like a thesis statement or a well edited wrap up, but a couple of.
How about
things...
a solution? Do you have a solution?
Yeah, I do. I do have a solution. Yes.
Solve our problems, please.
Yeah. So, one thing I wish we would stop doing, this is maybe a majoring on the minors. One thing I wish we would stop doing is talking about Donald Trump. I mean, I've already mentioned in this broadcast my not liking the term running for a third term, because he cannot run for a third term. Now, if we're talking about him serving a third term, that's also bad. because somebody who serves a third term in the American system, that term will never end. So it's not a matter of Trump having a third term. It's whether or not he would be a king and whether the United States, as we understand it, will still exist. Sorry to be for the catastrophic thinking, but if Donald Trump is in office on January 20th at noon 2029, this country doesn't exist. Have a good night, guys.
I agree. I agree. I mean, you're right.
Well, thanks for wrapping her up for us, Ken. That's such your... But no, I'm grateful we live in a country in which we can speak about this freely and even laugh. But it is
So
a
far.
serious... so far, it is a serious subject, right? And this is something that we, as Americans, we ought to take serious. I think you can get way in over your skis of looking at a specific movement or individual and saying, aha, there's the end of the country. But it is true that spirit of fanaticism, that spirit of authoritarianism is in the air, maybe more than it has been at any other point in our lifetimes. And that is scary. And it's not something that can't be overcome, but it is something that one ought to take serious. I appreciate every one of you gentlemen. Obviously, we don't agree on all points here, but I think we are all very dedicated Americans who want to see the democratic liberal project continue. I realize those are kind of buzzwords from a conservative audience standpoint. I'll say the Republic of the United States, as delivered to us from our founders, continue. I do appreciate you guys' time. Steve, John, Blake, Mike, Kent, always a pleasure. Had all of you on multiple times in the past, always profited from our conversations. Thank you also to everyone who hung with us and was watching, and we will see you guys next time.
Good night.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much.